Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with two guests. Dr. Nick Chader, Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School. He works on rationality and language using a range of theoretical and experimental approaches. And Dr. Morten Christiansen, William R. Kenan Jr., Professor of Psychology at Cornell University. His research focuses on the interaction of biological and environmental constraints in the evolution, acquisition, and processing of language. And today we're going to focus on their new book, The Language Game, How Improvisation Created Language and Changed the World. So, Dr. Chader, you're a repeat guest. Welcome back to the show. Dr. Christiansen, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you both on.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, great. So let's start with a simple question. How important is language in human evolution and for human society?
Well, language is essential to what it means to be human. Yet we rarely give it a second thought, and we oftentimes only discover just how important it is when it fails, such as if we're in a foreign city or we lose our language ability following a stroke. And if we imagine that language suddenly disappeared, then our societies would collapse. We would be unable to coordinate and reason with each other and just generally get about with our normal business. And if we consider what happened if we hadn't invented language in the first place, we'd be unable to share ideas, we've been able to plan together, build up societies, cultures, or develop any kind of cultural or technological sophistication. So we need really to look no further than our primate cousins, the great apes, to see just how limited our societies would be without language. So language is sort of crucial for human evolution and human society.
You present a very interesting view of language and how it works in the book that goes against some of the main takes of language that we get in linguistics, like, for example, the more Noam Chomsky-oriented people, the nativists, let's say. So what do you mean exactly in the book when you say that language is like an endless community-wide game of charades?
Yeah, so a good example of this, which we talk about in the book, is what happens when people who have no common language, indeed very little common cultural or technical background, interact, and how remarkably good people are at doing this. There's a famous episode where Captain Cook is going around the Tierra del Fuego, and he arrives at a lone beach and suggests going to, quote, talk with the people. And that they then meet some local people who are almost certainly Haush, now sadly extinct group, and their language was extraordinarily different from any European language, and yet they managed to get along surprisingly well. So, for example, one thing that happened was the Haush sent a couple of people across the beach on their own. Cook's team sent a couple out on their own, essentially displaying vulnerability, and then the Haush have some small sticks which they throw aside ostentatiously, which the Cook's men think, well, I guess that means they're not going to be threatening us because they're throwing aside their weapons. And this is the right interpretation. They actually are getting along pretty well. They're soon exchanging goods. They're eating on board ship. So it turns out to be completely possible to start communicating in quite a complex way without a common language. Now, interestingly, of course, and we do this when we play the game of charades, when we're actually, we deliberately shut down our language and have to communicate without it. We can still do it. But of course, when you play the same charade game again and again, or you have the same encounter between two groups with no common language, you tend to reuse the charades that you used before. And those charades gradually become standardized, conventionalized, or entrenched. And of course, you also tend to use them in ever more creative ways. So you think, well, now I have a charade for I don't know, for a ship, but now I'm going to use that same charade for water or a boat or whatever it may be. So there's this continual entrenchment, but also you're gradually expanding the repertoire of those charades. Now, this might sound like a theory which is predicated on the idea that language begins as gesture, sign language. Essentially, sign language come first. And many people do think that's the case, but that's not essential to the idea. The same story would work if we were using not gestures, but sounds to communicate with each other. So essentially, you start with fairly arbitrary signals which are created and used in the moment. You reuse and reuse, and you create patterns and systems out of those in a gradual way. So rather than thinking that, as say Chomsky did, that and still does, I guess, that the structure of language is built into the brain, we're saying no, the structure of language emerges very gradually, as it were, improvisation by improvisation. It's the layers of improvisations running on top of each other and being reused in different ways that gradually creates complex patterns which we think of as grammar.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, to what extent would you say we need to know rules to be able to use language?
Yeah, I think from this point of view, not that much. So I think we have a very sort of example-first approach to understanding language. So to learn a language, you have to learn how to use particular communicative conventions in particular contexts and to generalize piece by piece from those. And over time, both within a child and also within the entire the population of speakers, these examples will become somewhat more orderly. But the rules are sort of secondary, and they're always partial. So essentially, it's examples first and quasi-irregular patterns later.
Mm-hmm. And if I might add, it also, I mean, many times, as Nick was saying, these rules are very partial, and oftentimes they don't really work in the long term because language is highly flexible. So, and we keep on breaking whatever rules one might suggest. So, take for example the word or the verb sneeze, to sneeze. That's considered to be what's called an intransitive verb, meaning that you can sneeze, I can sneeze, he can sneeze, and so on. But we don't say, the grammar would suggest that we don't say something like John sneezes something. Yet we can improvise and understand a sentence like Kisha sneezes the foam off her cappuccino, and we can even see it in our mind what would happen. Yet that would break the rule of what intransitive verbs can actually do. So, in other words, the spontaneous use of language seems to be much more important and doesn't really fit very neatly with the idea of sort of kind of straitjacketing within a set of rules.
Mm-hmm. So, putting the rules aside, we also have the cognitive mechanisms or the supposed cognitive mechanisms that we have to have set in place for us to be able to produce and comprehend language. I mean, do you agree with this, that what really sets us apart from other animals in terms of being able to use language is that we have evolved a specific set of cognitive mechanisms that are specialized for language, or even brain areas or regions that are specialized for language production and comprehension?
I guess our answer would be no. So both Nick and I have been working on this question for quite some time now, and we also discussed this in our new book. And our suggestion is, rather than having sort of built-in, sort of hardwired universal grammar or language faculty or something like that, what we are suggesting is that language is piggybacking on many different kinds of non-linguistic abilities. And these might include constraints on how our thought processes work, or how our bodies, sensory motor systems work, combined with social pragmatic factors that derive from how we tend to interact with one another as a species. And of course, there are cognitive limitations on how we learn, what we can remember, and how we process information in the here and now. And all these constraints, we think, come together to influence the cultural evolution of languages. And different languages might take different paths through cultural evolution. And that would make, give rise to the variation we see across the world's more than 7,000 languages on the one hand. Yet on the other hand, we also, the constraints that we all share, that are non-linguistic, these will make sure that there will be certain patterns that are more likely to occur than others. And also prevent that sort of impossible things that from occurring, such as, things that we couldn't say or we couldn't remember and so on. But these are not due to a universal grammar in our account, but really due to sort of underlying sort of cognitive and communicative constraints.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea about how languages might have begun? I mean, how they might have first evolved?
Well, first of all, we think that most likely probably language have emerged multiple times in different places across the world. And I think the Hausch encounter, or the encounter between Hausch and Cook and his crew that Nick mentioned early on, is a good example of how when people are brought together, they are sort of interacting, they can sort of create a way of communicating sort of fairly readily. And if they have more time to work on these interactions, then actual language might emerge. And there's a very nice example of this in what's called Nicaraguan Sign Language. So I think it was about 20 or 30 years ago, deaf children in Nicaragua were brought together in 2 schools in Managua. And initially they were taught signed Spanish, or not signed Spanish, sorry. They were asked to sort of do lip reading and sort of try to figure out to actually listen to Spanish. Of course, they were deaf, so they had a hard time doing that. And actually what happened is that the children would gradually themselves evolve together a new sign language. Now, each of these kids, when they were back home with their families, they had sort of developed what's called home signs. So these are sort of little systems, rudimentary systems that allow the kids to interact with their parents. And of course, different kids would have slightly different ways of communicating with their parents using different kinds of signs. And they might do like something like that if they're thirsty or something else. But over time, what would happen when the kids were interacting with one another, they would gradually sort of conventionalize certain ways of using certain signs, so that early on in sort of the first generations of kids brought together, they had a lot of variation in the different signs. But in later generations, we see much more sort of conventionalized signs for example, a horse or something else. So that would happen gradually over time. So we think this is sort of a good model of how language might have evolved, and also how it could have emerged multiple times in sort of human history.
Mm-hmm. But did it start with gestures or vocalizations? I mean, is it possible for us to know that?
Well, I think it's hard to know without a time machine. If we had a time machine, we could really answer many of these questions. Unfortunately, we don't have that. But of course, as Nick was alluding to earlier, it might seem that because gestures are involved in playing charades, yet there's some really ingenious studies that a psychologist, Michael Perlman, and his colleague conducted, and they called this study called the Vocalic Iconicity Challenge. And what they did is they asked researchers interested in language evolution to come up with different sounds, only using the human vocal apparatus. They couldn't use speech as such. And they had to come up with sounds for different kinds of meanings, and whoever could produce sort of the most iconic sound, the sound that would indicate what they meant just by the sound of them, they would win the prize. And they then tested it on a number of participants later on, and actually it turns out that they found that the winning entries were actually quite easy to get the meaning of. So these were things like water, knife, cut, tiger, and so on. And then they later conducted a web survey asking native speakers of more than 20 different languages as dissimilar as Albanian, Zulu, Amharic, Thai, and even Danish, which is my native language. And they asked people to guess the intended meaning of these vocalizations, and people could do it really well. They all were able to do it, above chance. And then they even went one step further, and they tested non-literate populations in remote field locations in the Amazon jungle in Brazil and in the Vanuatu archipelago in the South Pacific, all with really good results. So what this suggests is that although gestures seem like an easy way of coming up with sort of ways of expressing yourself, we can also do it using our voice as well. The human voice is a very flexible sort of tool that we can use to evoke meaning even in the absence of words.
Mm-hmm. Is the way people pronounce words or the sounds we use in any way connected to their meaning? Because since there seems to be, at least with some sounds, these above average ability that people have to associate them cross-culturally with certain meanings. I mean, am I interpreting this correctly?
Yes. So, of course, for a long time, there's been this idea of the arbitrariness of the sign, and certainly that plays an important role, and Nick can speak to that also. But I think what also has been shown over the last about couple of decades is that there are a number of patterns that seem to show up again and again. So I was involved with in a study where we looked at more than 6,000 different languages and dialects across the world, and we are looking at possible relationships between specific sounds and possible meaning. And we found that even controlling for geography, so languages that are closely related, that are located close to one another, might have similar patterns, and likewise also controlling for historical relationship between languages. We found even controlling for that there were certain relationships between specific sounds and meanings that would show up again and again across the world. So, for example, if a language has a concept for the color red, then it's more likely than not that word has an R sound in it somewhere, like it has, for example, in Indo-European languages like English and French and Spanish. I don't know about Portuguese, but what's the word for red in Portuguese?
Vermelho.
That is an R in there too, I suppose.
Yes.
Nick, do you want to
just to add on to that? So if you're starting from a charades perspective, then you'd expect there to be relationships between sounds and meanings, because if we're starting from scratch, if I'm trying to get my meaning across to you, I'm going to try and pick something that is evocative. So rather than like the Perlman challenge that Morten was just mentioning, I'm going to try to make a glugging sound if I'm talking about water, or a rasping sound if I'm talking about cutting, or something of this kind. But so an interesting question is why language is so arbitrary. I mean, there are absolutely these patterns, and these are extremely interesting and widespread patterns of relationship between sound and meaning. But on the other hand, it's not the case that every language of the world expresses the concept dog, but with a kind of woof sound. In fact, quite the opposite. The languages that have enormously different words for dog, most of them having no relationship to the sound of a dog. And so an interesting reason why this is the case comes from an argument by our colleague Padraig Monaghan, now at Lancaster University and the University of Amsterdam. And Padraig's point is that if you make the sounds and meanings aligned in your language, it makes disambiguating what people mean very difficult. So a good example of this would be if it were the case that all dog sounds were some variation of woof, so each breed of dog is a slightly different woof, then if you're at a dog show and you want to point out a particular type of dog, you just can't do it, because the sounds all just sound the same and the meanings are all the same too. Because they're all different kinds of dog, and you just can't use the context effectively to discriminate. But if the sounds and the meanings are completely disconnected, then the context tells you, well, the meaning must be this, because look, these are the things in front of me, and the sounds give you a clue which is completely separate from that, completely non-connected. And those different, unconnected, non-correlated signals are actually going to be much more effective at pinning down the reference. So in the case of if I've got a whole bunch of different dog words which are completely different, all the breeds of dog have different names, then when I use one of them, say Dachshund or something, then in the dog show I can think, well, it must be that Dachshund, because all the other dogs are called completely different things. They're called Chihuahuas and Dobermans. So the idea is you really need for language will have a tendency to become arbitrary over time. But as we've said, language is continually is evolving from these patterns of charades, and continually new charades are being created. So we're always going to have these sound meaning patterns, and they're always going to show through. And when you do the kind of statistical analysis Morten's been talking about, there they are. And so the charade-like origins of language are always still lurking, hidden.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain why in the book you say that linguistic communication is a cooperation process?
Well, yes. So I think the thing about linguistic communication is that one of us throws out a signal, puts a signal into the world. It could be a gesture or some sounds, and we both have to look at that signal and think, what does that mean? What does that convey? And we have to agree on the answer. So if I say point to something as trivial as that, I've got to think, well, that my gesture of pointing is pointing towards this particular window or chair or sofa. And you've got to look at my pointing gesture and think, oh, that's pointing towards the same window or chair or sofa. So we've got to agree on the mapping between the meaning and the signal. And that process of reaching that common agreement is kind of essential to communication. If we don't agree on that, we can't disagree about facts. We can't argue. We can't even get going on that level. We have to cooperate on the meanings, because otherwise we can't even begin to debate. So there's something really essential about coordinating our minds. We have to our connection between meanings and signals. And of course, we're in the context of charades, this is clearly difficult, because we have to be really creative in doing that. I do some strange action and you think he's trying to do a dinosaur. Oh, maybe this is Jurassic Park. And I have to try to imagine what you're going to think. You're imagining what I'm going to think. We've got to come up with some mapping between the message I'm trying to convey and these strange gestures or pantomime I'm doing. And so this is often a very challenging sort of cooperative coordination process.
Mm-hmm. And what is the role played by improvisation specifically in language evolution?
Well, what we are suggesting, and again we are borrowing from this notion of language as charade, is that all we're ever trying to do when we are communicating is trying to make sense of what somebody else is doing in the moment, given the different kinds of clues that we are offered. And that's of course the same when we play charades. And when we see language as charade, it kind of helps shape this intuitive and mistaken picture of how language works. So oftentimes the rough and tumble of everyday language has been viewed as a sort of a pale shadow of some ideal language out there where the words have clear meanings and are put together following well-defined grammatical rules. But we think that this traditional story has things exactly backwards. So real languages are not sort of slightly mangled variants of a purer, more orderly kind of linguistic system. Instead, actual language is always a matter of collaborative improvisation that Nick mentioned this, and of trying to find a way in the moment to meet our communicative demands. And so that's very similar to when we play charades. So this means that the kind of stable regularities of grammar that we do see are not really the starting points, but rather they are the result of countless of generations of interacting with one another in sort of in the moment and through and this is how linguistic patterns over time can become entrenched, so that we see these kind of recurring patterns, but they're going to be flexible and partial patterns. So we get this partial ordering emerging from the kind of chaotic interactions that we engage in all the time.
Mm-hmm. So taking into account, because this is also something that you talk about in the book, taking into account the limitations of our memory and how easily we get distracted when we're interacting verbally with other people, how is it that we keep up with language? I mean, how is it that we can comprehend language and what other people are saying?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So if you take arbitrary sounds, so just a random set of noises, or a squeak and a bang and a crash, and you put those into a sequence and you play them to people, they can only recall the order of about 4 sounds. So they can say, oh, there was a squeak, and then there was a bang, and there was a crash. And you have to have quite large gaps between them too. So you'd have to have a quarter of a second gap. If you make the gaps much shorter, they can't tell the order. So they go, lots of stuff happened. I don't know what came first. So we have a really short memory, and we have really bad time perception. We don't know what came before what. Now, with language, of course, we're dealing with hundreds of phonemes and hundreds of speech sounds every minute. So this tremendous torrent. So it's a mystery, you're indicating it's a mystery on the face of it. How on earth are we able to cope with this? Given that our memory seems to be so limited. And I think the answer is a very simple one, which is that we have to take that stream of material and break it down and process it as it comes in extremely quickly. So we get a bunch of speech sounds, we have to recognize those sounds and think that's a particular, say, syllable, or maybe a particular morpheme. So that's essentially a chunk, the minimal chunk of language that has meaning. So it could be a stem of a word or a verb ending or something. And then we have to chunk those together into words, and then we have to chunk those together into short phrases. And that chunking process has to happen straight away. Because if it doesn't happen straight away, if I wait, then more phonemes come charging in, and my memory is then, as it were, overloaded. So the process is this incredibly fast and fluent process of building small chunks and bigger chunks of those chunks and bigger chunks. And that process of chunking is going along at multiple levels of representation, from sounds to words to phrases and whole chunks of discourse all the time.
Mm-hmm. I think we can actually sort of illustrate that by doing a little experiment. So Ricardo, you're going to be our participant here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read a list of letters out aloud to you, and then when I say recall, then I want you to say back these letters for me. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. S, R, N, E, D, S, T, E, I. Recall.
S, R, N, T, E. I mean, I guess I've already got it wrong.
It was tricky. So these are 9 letters. So this is impossible. So, our normal working memory for sort of arbitrary letters is about 4 plus minus 1 or so. So you did quite well there. But you're the dissenter, right? So I'm going to give you another try at this. So are you ready?
Yes, please go ahead.
D, I, S, S, E, N, T, E, R. Recall.
D, I, E, S, S, N, T, R, I guess. Perhaps I got the 2 last letters wrong.
You nearly got it right. I was hoping you would do better on this one, because what I of course spelled out for you was dissenter, Dissenter, and so essentially,
this is a really good illustration, because if you don't spot that, indeed you probably won't do, because you're not processing. If you'd seen it, of course, it'd be obvious. If you don't spot it, it makes little difference. It's still hard. But if you had spotted it, you'd have it in one. It would be completely trivial. So it's all a matter of, if you can find the chunk. It doesn't matter whether the chunk is there. The question is, can you see it? If you see the chunk, you're fine.
It's a way of chunking. Of course, this also is crucial, relying on experience with language. So the more you have come across how you spell dissenter and so on, and you probably haven't heard it spelled out a lot necessarily, but if you had heard it spelled out a lot, you would sort of kind of be able to chunk that very easily. And so the idea is that when we're doing what we call sort of chunk and pass, across these different levels, from phonemes or syllables to words to phrases and so on, we are sort of doing a similar kind of process. Of course, we're not doing it consciously as we were just doing, but it illustrates just the power of chunking, that whereas in the original thing there were 9 letters, but if you chunk it together to dissenter, that's just one chunk you have to remember, and that makes it much easier. And every time you do that, it buys you some time to sort of deal with the onslaught of input that comes at us all the time. So, because we speak incredibly fast, as Nick was mentioning.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's how you explain how people chunk sounds into words, right?
Yes. Yeah, so we chunk the acoustic input into, at first there's acoustic information. It might be into phonemes or syllables, or some other kind of sound-based unit, depending on. There might be some differences across languages. So, for example, in Japanese, they might use something called mora, whereas, in other languages might use syllables and so on. But then as soon as we have multiple instances of these chunks, say phonemes, then they're going to start interfering with one another. So there's a need then to chunk those further into larger units. And then, again, the same problem happens again. And then we do the chunking again. And this allows us to deal with this sort of rapid onslaught of input that is spoken language under sort of normal circumstances, like when we are talking together right now.
Mm-hmm. About the meaning of words, can we really say that they have a particular meaning, each of them?
Yeah, this is a good question. So I think our natural instinct from, as it were, school is to think, well, every word has a meaning, or maybe some words have several meanings, and they're all in the dictionary, so it's kind of very clear. But in reality, that's quite wrong. And indeed, given our charade-based perspective, it has to be wrong, because words gain their communicative significance by being used in particular contexts. Mm-hmm. So it's only over time, we're using a word again and again, that patterns start to emerge in the way in which a particular signal, a particular sign is used. And that pattern is always going to be endlessly flexible and endlessly changeable. So if we take a word, which we talk about this in the book, a word like light, you might think, well, light is a really, really simple word. And let's think of it. Obviously, it's a noun. And actually, different kinds of lights. There's lamps or lights, and you can have a light in colloquial English can be a flame that you use to light a pipe or a cigarette. But also think of it as an adjective. So in English, you have things like say a light sky would be a pale sky, or you could have a light warship, which would be one without too much armor, or a light tank. Or you might have a light red wine, or you might have a light burden on, which would be something that doesn't weigh very much that you're carrying along. And all of these endless. I mean, there literally dozens of cases. All of these have some kind of metaphorical relationship to each other. You can kind of think, well, what would a light infantry be? Well, I guess they'd have to be infantry who aren't carrying too much stuff around. It sort of makes sense, and that's basically right. But it's not that there's a single meaning. It's that there's a related patchwork of meanings, which are all sort of loosely interconnected, but in a really complicated way. To the famous, the great philosopher Wittgenstein used to talk about family resemblance pattern. What he meant by this, often people think in psychology, they think, oh, family resemblance, that means we all look kind of the same. Everyone from that family looks kind of the same. And that's not what he meant at all. He meant that within a family, some people might share a nose, other people will share a chin, some people share eyes. So the ways in which we look similar, we can all be identified as part of the same family, aren't really because we all share a common core. It's because there's a kind of network of interrelations. And that's, I think, the normal pattern. So the idea that dictionaries contain meanings is actually false. And if you look at a dictionary, what it really contains is lots of examples. So it gives you a loose idea what the word's about, and says, as in here, here's another example, here's another example, which of course makes sense from the Charades point of view. It doesn't really make sense from a kind of classical view that every word has a precise definition.
Mm-hmm. And even those examples, as you call them, that come in the dictionary, I mean, they're changing all the time, right? As people use languages in new contexts.
Absolutely, yes. The language is always changing to deal with the world as we encounter it. So different styles of music, new pieces of technology. I mean, we start talking about tweeting used to be all about bird song. Now it's about sending 140 characters. Yeah, of course, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we've already talked about the evolution of human language, generally speaking. With your framework in mind, how do you explain how a particular language comes to be?
Well, I mean, first of all, we talked earlier about how a language can emerge just from interaction. So that, the house and cook example is that over time they might develop a language. Now, they didn't because they were only there together for a few days. But so when we had Nicaraguan sign, we can see a language emerge. Now, but different languages might move in different directions. And so when we look across the world today, there are about 7,000 different languages, and some are suggesting that there has been in human history many more languages, and we have actually sort of lost many different languages. So part of what happens is that as each group of humans tended to become somewhat isolated from one another and develop their own sort of subcultures and so on, they needed different ways of expressing themselves. And then also you would get simply drift, that words meaning the meaning of words and the sounds of words might change across time. And in fact, one thing that we don't often realize is that even our own language in our own lifetime actually changes quite dramatically. So there's a beautiful study of Queen Elizabeth and her vowel space done by some Australian linguists. And they found that even within your lifetime, your own language actually can change quite dramatically and measurably so much so that the Queen Elizabeth no longer speaks the Queen's English of 40 years ago. So her vowel space has changed. It's become closer to what the average person would speak about 40 years ago. But of course, the average person too have changed. So she still sounds somewhat posh relative to other people. And that's just an example of how even our own language and the words we use change across time. So we can think of different languages as not as much as sort of separate units as such. It's notoriously difficult to sort of distinguish between a dialect and a language, and oftentimes there's this suggestion by Max Wainwright that a language is a dialect with an army and a flag, but clearly within many different countries, there are actually multiple languages that have existed, and there might be a dominant language, but the best way of thinking about language is really as a collection of idiolects, meaning different ways of using words, different vocabularies, different phrases, and so on. We each, in a sense, speak our own language that will die out when we pass away. But of course, these languages within a community is closely enough to each other so that we can actually communicate and understand one another. So we're all playing sort of linguistic charades using our own idiolect.
Mm-hmm. So we've already touched a little bit on Noam Chomsky and nativism here. What would you say are your main criticisms of universal grammar? What do you think are the main issues with it?
Well, I start by saying that I think one problem is we've gone up into it's simply unnecessary. So the idea that the sort of starting point for understanding language is seeing that all languages have these common patterns on the one hand, and we have to explain them. And the other big driver, perhaps even bigger for Chomsky, was thinking that the process of acquiring a language for a child is just so mysterious. You end up with this complex language from a messy input of language from the people around them. That must both of those things, the universality of supposed patterns across languages and the problem of acquiring a language, must mean that there's a language instinct, essentially, or a language organ built in. And I think we would say, on one hand, well, actually looking for language universals, they just don't seem to exist. So languages are incredibly varied. They're not limitlessly varied. So as Morten was saying, the constraints on our minds, constraints on perception, things we can easily say, memory and so on, they will make it possible for us to culturally evolve some languages and not others. But they are incredibly varied. The sounds and the patterns are just tremendously varied. So there's no evidence for these kind of mysterious hidden patterns. And the other thing, of course, is that the reason children find the language so easy to learn is because language has been evolved culturally to be learnable. And if a language is hard to learn, it's not going to get learned. No one's going to be speaking it. So languages themselves are shaped around us. We have this phrase, language is shaped by the brain, which we're rather keen on. So rather than thinking that the brain has somehow encoded the patterns of language, it's much more that language over generations of cultural evolution has to be easy for the brain to learn. It has to reflect the natural bias of the human brain. So I think our perspective would be that universal grammar, you can't quite rule it out as a priori, but there's just no reason. I mean, why would you postulate it? It's sort of unnecessary, really.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also important to note that universal grammar, at least as it's been sort of construed by Noam Chomsky or Steven Pinker and others, is that there's actually no good evolutionary story for how that could have come into being in the first place. And that's sort of I think a big caveat, is that there's a missing evolutionary explanation for how we could have evolved a universal grammar, in the sense that it's typically defined as a set of very sort of abstract constraints on language acquisition. And the reason for this is that these constraints are not meant to be functional, in the sense that from the viewpoint of universal grammar, it's not meant to make language easier to learn or easier to use. It's surprisingly, I mean, it seems perhaps counterintuitive to many, me at least, and many others, but yet it's meant to be just these arbitrary constraints. And from that perspective, it's hard to imagine, or it's hard to come up with a reasonable evolutionary explanation for how that could have come into our heads in the first place. So not only doesn't really fit with what we actually see in terms of acquisition and in terms of universal patterns across languages on the one hand, but also there's actually no viable evolutionary explanation for it. So that's why we have taken a different route, where we are focusing on the cultural evolution of language instead, constrained by a number of different skills that we have that are not linguistic in nature, like I was mentioning earlier, like the way our thought processes work, constraints on cognition, pragmatics, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So we've probably already touched on the main points about this, but could you give us an overall view of what you call then construction grammar?
Yes, so within linguistics in the last, I suppose, 20 or 30 years, there's been an increasing focus not on a deep underlying abstract blueprint for language, but on the individual chunks, as we've been talking about, that language consists of. So these might be, essentially, these are chunks that connect together signals and meaning. So there'll be patches of sound which correspond to words which have some meaning. There'll be ways of putting together words, so verbs and nouns, say, or determiners and nouns to create meanings. And the idea is that language is much easier to describe by starting from these small chunks and putting those together. So linguists, and many of them who started off within Chomsky's framework, such as, for example, Peter Kalikofer and Ray Jackendoff, who both started within the Universal Grammar Framework, they and many others have started to see language as a kind of a layer upon layer of complex of construction. So the complexity comes from building up from one construction to the next. The theoretical perspective different construction grammarians have is quite varied, but I think this fits very naturally with our account, essentially because constructions are very close to chunks. And it also, so there's a kind of processing story which says the brain has to be forming these chunks, and that seems to be the natural unit from which you could build a language. But it's also interesting from the point of view of how children learn. So from the universal grammar story, it ought to be the case that these abstract patterns are always in position, and that children are kind of flapping about within the space of allowed languages to try and work out which of the possible languages in the world am I actually speaking. But it seems that it's much easier, but they're somehow conforming to these sort of rich abstract patterns, which are rather hard to actually identify. But it seems much easier to tell a story where you see children as learning these constructions one by one, or at least gradually, and then they're getting more and more fluid at putting them together and recombining them in intricate ways. So language is being built up from as it were, an ever increasing and more elaborate set of Lego bricks, rather than being laid out in a kind of fixed, in a fixed set of patterns built into the genes to start with.
Mm-hmm. Is there any good evidence that languages are taught to children? Because that's another big argument coming from Noam Chomsky, Steven Pinker, and others about the so-called poverty of the stimulus. But do you think that's correct?
Well, so I think that the poverty of stimulus, when it was originally proposed, which is 60 years ago, mm-hmm. It made sense because at the time there was very little knowledge about how kids actually learn. So there's few studies of how they learn. There's very little knowledge about what is actually available in the input. There was no sort of corpora of child-directed speech or anything like that. And also there was very little knowledge about what actually simple computational mechanisms could do with that kind of input. But now, 60 years later, there's been a huge amount of research that sort of come together to suggest that we really need to rethink the poverty of stimulus, that actually the stimulus may be much richer than what we thought. So, for example, we know that kids are very good at picking up on statistical information in the input. So there's loads and loads of studies of what's called statistical learning, where they're studying that even young infants can pick up on statistical regularities in the input. There's also been a huge number of corpus analysis of essentially speech directed to children. And what they found is there's a lot of recurring patterns there, like some of which we've talked about here already, that kids can pick up on and use to produce language. And then finally, we're also getting a much better idea of what fairly simple computational mechanism can do without any kind of built-in grammars or universal constraints or anything like that. They can actually acquire aspects of language that would seem comparable to what we can see in children. So I think the poverty of the stimulus is not as pressing as it used to be. And I think it's time for us perhaps to sort of move beyond that and actually look at, okay, what can kids actually do? So instead of sort of a priori kind of saying that, oh, we have the poverty of the stimulus, actually what we need to do instead, okay, look at the stimulus. And that's, once we do that, I think it's not actually as big of a problem as we used to thought. So actually there's a lot of work showing that, yes, children can learn this and this aspect of language given the nature of their input, given their learning mechanisms and what we know about them.
Mm-hmm. So, is there any relationship between being able to use language and the sociality of a given species, its social complexity, for example? And do you think that that would be at least one of the explanations for why, at least as far as we know, there is no other species out there that uses language?
Well, yeah, I think that humans are a phenomenally social species. I mean, we're not the only species that relies on interactions with each other. You can look at the social insects, or you can look at all kinds of mammals that live together. But the thing that's remarkable about us is the incredible flexibility in our societies. So we can shape our societies in many different ways. We have hugely different patterns of belief across societies. We have different social structures. We continue inventing new technologies, new new laws, new ways of living, and no other animals doing that. So there are basically animals have fairly fixed social structures, and genetically the same set of animals will have a very small range of possible social patterns. They may be quite complex, but they will be standardized. And humans aren't like that at all. They're phenomenally inventive. So we started off as hunter-gatherers, but now we've just got an extraordinary plethora of different social structures of amazing complexity, including, of course, all the incredibly complicated things we do over the internet. And I think that the deeply social nature of humanity and its flexible sociality is something that's probably pretty fundamental. And it might be, and I think Michael Tomasello, a primatologist and language acquisition researcher, a very important figure in the field and also in our thinking. And someone like Michael Tomasello would argue that there is something fundamentally unique about human social behavior, which goes back to this question of cooperation and coordination that we talked about earlier. Yeah. So he would say that if we're trying to communicate, we've got to coordinate on the relationship between signals and meanings. So what is this charade about? We have to be able to coordinate on that. But also that's true if we're going to do something together. So we're going to help each other do a task. We have to think, what is the task? Which bit am I doing? Which bit are you doing? So we have to be able to break down a complex task and do it together. So if we're going to work as a team, we have to be able to agree what the team's objectives are and who's got what role. And humans are really good at that, and other animals really don't seem to be able to do it in the same way. So they're very good at doing standardized tasks, which we're genetically programmed. So ants, for example, can do complicated coordinated behavior, but they can't be flexible. They can't say, "Oh no, you leave that task, I'll do this one, and we'll change the way we do things." There's none of that. They have, they work on, as it were, tram lines by comparison to us, anyway. So I think there probably is something very, very significant about that. Perhaps it may be the social sophistication of humans, which is one of the key underpinnings of language, anyway.
Mm-hmm. And I think also just to add to that, there's probably also a number of other things that have made us sort of ready to have language, or for language to sort of take off by way of cultural evolution. And some of these are, for example, our ability to do vocal learning. There are other species that do vocal learning as well, but we are particularly good at it. Likewise, for example, our ability to learn a huge number of mappings between a form that can be either a speech, a word, the sound for a word, or a sign, if we're talking about sign language, and a meaning, even though the meanings may vary. But still, most of us have a vocabulary of tens of thousands of words, and that's something that we don't, for example, see in other primates. And then lastly, also our ability to pick up on complex sequential structure may also be something that have contributed. So the social abilities are clearly very important, but it's also, I think, a combination with many other things that makes us clever and flexible in our ways of playing linguistic charades. That's kind of what have, I think, very likely have given rise to our ability to play verbal charades or linguistic charades in general, and then that have given rise to our ability to interact more generally and develop sort of complex societies that we have today. Of course, this was a very long process, of course, not something that just happened overnight.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, so there's at least, or we should expect that there's at least some cognitive mechanisms that we have that other, even close animals lack, even if they are not specialized or adapted specifically to language, that would also play a role in explaining why they are not able to use language.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, so it's that there's a whole suite of skills that are required, And it seemed that we happened to have the right mix for language to be able to get going. And it's only been, we don't know how long language has existed for, but it's perhaps several 100,000 years, not very long in the history of evolution. So it may be that if you ran if that hadn't happened, if you ran primate evolution forwards, some other branch of the primate lineage would have produced something similar at some later point. But it just, it's not that this could only ever happen in our species. It's just that someone had to get there first, or some species had to get there first. It happened to be us.
Yeah, and I think it's probably also the case that it may not be a matter of other animals not having these skills. It just happens to be that they don't have it necessarily at the same level of complexity or proficiency as we may have, and also perhaps language is much older than just a few 100,000 years. So at least the rudimentary ability for communicating. So if it's building on charades, it probably goes back even further, as been suggested by a number of other people recently. So, but again, we don't really know. That's one of these questions that, those of us who are interested in language evolution, if we could have a time machine, right, we would really perhaps be able to answer these questions. But they are exciting questions to ask, and I think we are getting better at giving sort of more reasonable answers to them.
Yes, so I mean, at least one of the aspects you're referring to is that the cognitive mechanisms that play a role in language production and comprehension and acquisition, I mean, it could be not really a matter of differences in kind, but differences in degree, correct?
Exactly.
So, I mean, I've mentioned, and we talked about the relationship between sociality and language, but language also influences sociality, right? I mean, the kinds of ways we can interact with one another and establish relationships, correct?
Yeah, I think we see this as a potential route to understanding why human brains are so big and why humans are so smart. So there's a potential runaway effect here, because if it's the case that you start to develop, if you have enough sociality and indeed, as Morten was saying, other abilities such as dealing with complex sequential information, if you have those abilities in place and you start to be able to develop a complex system of linguistic communication, that allows you to develop a social world which is much more complicated. So you can start to have arguments with each other, you can have rules, you can have religions, you can have taboos, you can work as a team, you can do all kinds of complicated things. But that means, of course, that the people who are very good at these social interactions are going to be the ones who do well. So being, as it were, a strong, healthy person is not really the key. The key is being a good social being, because the society is getting more complicated. But that means that's going to put extra pressure on social intelligence, and that's going to make language even more complicated and elaborate, because if it's the case that the social intelligence is underpinning language, and so there's this positive feedback loop. So our suggestion is that, and of course, another part of the feedback loop is that as we create language, as Morten was talking about earlier, that allows us to do all kinds of other things. So one of the very simplest is that we can pass on skills and insights and ways of living much more easily from one person to the next. So we can build up complex technologies and social rules and so on. So our societies become more complicated, our social brains become more complicated, our languages therefore become more complicated still. And so there may be a runaway selection, which would explain why the human brain is sort of 3 times or so bigger than our ancestors from 2 million years ago. There's just been a lot of pressure on being smart, but it's really being socially smart is the key, and having the ability to communicate is probably a crucial element of that.
So we can say also that language influences the evolution of culture, correct?
Yes, and I think language is crucial for pretty much everything we do, as we also alluded to in the beginning. So what language allows us to, as Nick was mentioning, is allow us to transmit knowledge, modify, criticize, and so on. And so in fact, the importance of language to the development of human societies and cultures has even been suggested to be a major transition in evolution, on par with the transition from single-cell organisms like bacteria to multi-cell organisms such as plants and animals. And so similarly to this sort of massive change in evolution, the emergence of language have changed the nature of human evolution, allowing us to develop societies, laws, science, technology, allowing us to talk together like we're doing right now. And that has all done through fast-paced cultural evolution rather than the much, much slower biological evolution, which other animals have to rely on primarily. So what language has done is makes us the most successful species on Earth, for better or worse. And so much so that we now even have a geological period named after us, the Anthropocene, in recognition of just how much impact we've had on the planet and all the life forms on it. So language is clearly crucial for evolution of culture and everything we do with it.
Mm-hmm. So in certain intellectual circles, people make the case or try to make a case that language in general is declining. I mean, for different people, that might mean slightly different things. Like, for example, language is getting less complex, more simplistic. Language is getting more impure if you get into the more etymological side of things, for example. Do you agree with that?
No, I think we don't. I think we're sort of on the side here of fairly conventional linguistic thinking. So I think most linguists who look at the details of language change tend to see at least as much creativity and new patterns emerging as old patterns declining. So what happens is that there's continual turnover. So words change their meaning. So words that are used in one way start to get used in another way. And if you're used to using them in the old way, you think this word is being ruined. It used to mean this, and now it means something else. This is terrible. But on the other hand, or some distinction used to be made is no longer being made. But then the way that language responds to that is the distinction will be made in some new way. The language will find some new way of marking a distinction. So essentially, the change always looks negative to the old, as it were, the older generation, because we as the older generation just see changes going away from what we know, but we don't appreciate all the novelty and innovation that's happening in language. And of course, this is evidence in the fact that people have been worried about linguistic decline as long as people have been thinking about language at all. So certainly for the English language, and from the very earliest period, I mean, when you had even Middle English, which is going back to the 14th century, there were complaints about the language in terminal decline. It was pretty much uninterpretable, and that's gone on right through the history of both English and pretty much every language, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also similar to what we see with other kinds of cultural products. So when it comes to music, for example, the kind of music that we grow up with, we might think of that's like the real good stuff. And then the music that the young people listen to these days is just terrible, right? So it's a little bit like everything. Language, like music, keeps on reinventing itself, keeps on wearing new ways of expressing ourselves and so on. And it's always going to be different from what we're used to. And that's going to seem like it's worse in some sense, or it's declining because it's not what we are used to. And so I think there's a lot of parallels there with other cultural products as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, applied specifically to technology, we've had tons of examples of older people in different societies demonizing new technology. They've even done so with books and mirrors and bicycles and cars. So perhaps that's just how we react to novel stuff and in comparison to what we've been brought up with. So.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've already touched a little bit on how children acquire language. Do you think that with the approach you present in the book to language, we can improve language skills in children?
I think it's possible. So in the book we make a few suggestions, but I think first and foremost, one of the things we need to do is to abandon. There is this old adage, old saying that children should be seen, not heard, and that is really a bad sort of saying when it comes to language acquisition. And so over the past few years, there's been a lot of research suggesting that what kids really need is interaction with parents or other adults in order to become proficient language users. And there has been some previous sort of focus on just having children learn more words, a little bit like if they were sort of passive sponges soaking up words. But what the newer research have suggested is that they really need to be engaged in conversation in order to learn, essentially become better at learning to play linguistic charades. And that can be done in a variety of different ways. So, for example, around bath time, you might sort of just engage with your child to talk with them as much as you can, asking them questions and so on. And likewise, if you're at the supermarket, it's boring for kids, but if you try to engage them in, so we're going to buy this for this purpose to make this kind of food, or that for a purpose and so on, then that's a way in which they can get sort of practice in playing linguistic charades, while also you can actually keep them engaged while you're shopping as well. So the more we can engage with children, the better. And that seems to be sort of a key factor in developing language skills.
Mm-hmm. So one of the biggest issues in linguistics we haven't touched on yet. What are your views on the idea that language influences how we think, our thought, and more specifically the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis?
Yes, so I mean, I think our thought on this is that the idea that language influences thought, in some senses, has got to be right. But the idea that it constrains or provides boundaries for thought is vastly overplayed. So, I mean, one way to think about it is to think about the way in which, say, well, first of all, think about charades. The fact that charades are very flexible. I mean, you can make a charade for anything. You're wrong to say my set of charades just isn't able to encompass. I simply can't do, I don't know, King Kong. It's just impossible because that film is just not in my repertoire. Because I can always invent new charades. I can always use the charades I've got in some clever way. And it may be slow, it may be difficult. Some things will be harder to say than others, based on which charades we've already, as it were, entrenched and pre-agreed. But it's always possible to express anything within any language, because the language is always a creative product. It's always being changed. But it's equally true that some things are easier to say than others. So if we just had a charade for gorilla, then telling you about King Kong is going to be a lot easier. So it's going to be the case that some languages therefore will tend to be specialized at discussing things that a particular society spends a lot of time talking about. So if your society spends an awful lot of time talking about different kinds of fruits and berries, or subtle botanical distinctions which matter for medicine in your forest, then you're going to have lots of words for those things, and an outsider won't. But they can create them. They can create them when they need to. So it's not that an outsider, when encountering a new language group, as it were, somehow their mind is unable to grasp the thoughts that this other group is dealing with. In fact, clearly we are able to learn other people's languages pretty effectively. But it's just the case that language biases us. It's just the same with notations. If you're going to do sums, it's jolly good to have standard notation for arithmetic with decimals and so on. That's really helpful. If you have Roman numerals, then arithmetic is a lot harder. And that's true for notations of all kinds. The language is just like that. But it's not putting boundaries on thought.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that there's any, at least partial evidence that language can change or influence how people perceive reality and the aspects of reality they might miss or pay attention to?
I think it's a matter of biasing our attention. So languages will shape what we focus on. So if I have lots of words for different kinds of tree, then as I wander through the forest, I will be thinking, oh, there's this type of tree and then that kind of tree. And I will be able to remember more about what I saw than somebody who just has the word tree. Or in fact, there's stories about a little child called William Brown, famous in England, called Just William Stories. And he has this comment that there are only two kinds of trees that can be climbed and trees that can be climbed. And of course, for a young child, that is a very reasonable distinction. So I might not even notice the climbable trees because I'm not interested in that. If I were him, I would see things differently. So I think all the time, the way we see the world depends on our interests, and that will partly, and indeed the linguistic resources we carry around. But it's all very, very flexible. So it's not that these are hard and fast, but they do embody, as it were, biases to pay attention to some things and less to others.
Yes, I was just thinking that because people live in different societies and have different economies and deal with different aspects of their ecologies, let's say, do you think that that gets manifested in the language they use? I mean, that the aspects of reality that they think are the most socially relevant, because that's the ones they pay attention to in their daily lives, is what gets manifested linguistically.
I think that makes sense to to a certain degree. So what is important for a particular community is what they're going to come up with, ways of playing linguistic charades about, and they may also in some way sort of guide what they're going to be picking up on other things and so on. So clearly it's going to lead sort of certain communities in certain directions. But again, it doesn't mean that they couldn't perceive it in a different way. It's just going to be much harder. But of course, if the whole community is sort of going in one direction, it can be hard to change, sort of switch gears, as it were. But it's not impossible. So what we are suggesting is that language is not a straitjacket that prevents us from thinking new things, but it can make it quite a bit harder if we are not set up for it. But it's not impossible. So I think it's a positive thing, because it suggests that no matter where we're living, what language we speak, there is always the opportunity that we can reach a common understanding together if we try hard enough. But again, sometimes we might have to try really hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, and even as adults, we can learn new languages and move to different societies and use those languages along with our own mother tongue, for example, because there's also this idea that people who learn more than one language have sort of a richer experience of reality. Do you think that there's any good evidence to back that up?
I mean, I think certainly you're going to be more in tune with the culture of the people that speak that language if you can speak to them in their sort of native language, so to speak. So I think it's very helpful in that regard. And you might also be more appreciative of certain distinctions, because oftentimes there are words that don't translate easily from one language to another, and they might play a particular role in sort of the social interactions of a particular community. And in order to really sort of capture those, you need to be able to speak the language. But it also means on the flip side is that, there is a real problem in terms of many indigenous languages or minority language are dying out because there's not enough speakers speaking them. And with those languages, oftentimes it's not just the language that disappears, but also because of the close sort of mesh between language and culture, we're going to lose part of those cultures as well when we lose the languages, and which is why it's important, and there's a lot of important work in sort of trying to revive and also keep sort of moribund languages alive. So I think there is a close connection, but again, by learning and speaking multiple languages, we can all sort of contribute to sort of keeping multiple cultures alive.
Mm-hmm. So one last question / topic, and this is something that you deal with toward the end of the book. You connect language, curiously, with the technological singularity. So could you explain the idea there? Is it that language can help us not become obsolete in face of this supposed technological singularity that is coming up somewhere in the future?
Well, of course, the singularity is this notion that at some point the computers will sort of run ahead of us and sort of, and there's a lot of famous people have been very worried about that. But if we look at language more generally, and we already talked a lot about how it's fundamental to both human culture and our society, But when we look to computers, even though they can do amazing things, they don't really understand language. They can do actually a lot of things with language. And of course, modern AI systems can do really fantastic things. They can fly across, millions of miles and land a spacecraft safely on Mars and fly a little helicopter there and so on. AI can beat us in many different kinds of games, chess, Go, and different kinds of video games as well. And many of these used to be thought of as these ultimate tests of intelligence. So it's quite understandable that people are worried about sort of the singularity. But when it comes to language, even though we've seen quite a lot of amazing feats, so there's Google Translate that can translate from one language to another, not always equally well. But also there's a new sort of kind of breed of large-scale language models, AI models. And they can actually write business reports or other kinds of text that seem to be indistinguishable from what humans can write. But despite all these amazing abilities, these AI systems, they don't really understand anything about what it is that they're saying. All they're doing is sort of piecing together little pieces of language and doing sophisticated pattern matching based on having pored over hundreds of billions of words from books, the internet, and Wikipedia, but importantly, they're not communicating. All they're doing is just they're responding, given a prompt in some way. They're not really communicating in a way that we are doing right now, the three of us. And most importantly, they don't actually play charades. So they don't really collaborate to communicate in the way that we think is crucial to understanding human language. And so even though they're good at spewing back sort of the best fitting linguistic patterns, but despite all the impressive linguistic abilities that these large language models have, they don't really understand anything of what they're saying. They're really good at doing very sophisticated pattern matching, and they're doing it based on having poured over hundreds of billions of words from books and Wikipedia and the internet. And most importantly, though, they don't play charades. They're not actually collaborating to communicate. They're not sort of engaging in dialogue and as such as what we are. They're simply just spewing back the best fitting, the most probable patterns, given what they're prompted with. So what we are suggesting in the book is that unless we start teaching computers to play charades, then we probably don't have to worry too much about the robot uprising or the technological singularity, because we'll always be able to outsmart them. But what we should be perhaps more worried about is people using computers in all sort of nefarious ways, such as through the propagation of fake news or conspiracy theories. That's actually where the use of computers can be more dangerous to us, I think.
Mm-hmm. But in that specific case, it's also how we use technology. It's not that technology itself is nefarious, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So I mean, in a way, there's a kind of a nice analogy with human motor control. I mean, we're incredibly good at moving around, picking things up, dancing, doing all kinds of somersaults, playing football, and no robot can do anything like those things. But on the other hand, robots are really good, or at least machines are really good at doing some of them. If you want to go very quickly, a car will go a lot faster than a person. So you could think, wow, these cars are just amazing. They're so fast. But that's a bit like saying, well, yeah, if you want to spew out an enormous number of words in grammatical order on a topic, computers could do that really well. But they're not doing it, just as the car is not mimicking a person. The computer, one of these same systems like GPT-3 that Morten was talking about, it's not in any sense mimicking what we're doing. It's doing something completely different. And as Morten was saying, without charade play, without understanding. So we shouldn't be threatened by that. I mean, it makes these very powerful tools for us because they can do things that we can't do easily, and they will help us, or indeed hinder us if they're used for ill rather than for good. But they're not, in any sense, replacing the amazing smartness of the human brain. So I think we're fooling ourselves if we look at things that computers can do and think, wow, the next moment they'll be taking my job, next moment they'll be taking over the world. That might one day be true, but we are very, very far from that now.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and
do you want to add? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
There's also another nice sort of illustrative example of in Japan, I think it was last year or the year before, they're trying to build like a robot hotel. That is a hotel that was only manned by actual robots, and it turned out not to work at all. So they couldn't actually deal with some of the things that and that a hotel guest would normally expect. So they're trying to automatize everything, but it didn't work at all. So it kind of, the robots were fired. So that's kind of, and humans were hired instead. So that was kind of interesting. So maybe we shouldn't be as afraid of the singularity as some people would have us be.
Yeah, so the Luddites don't have to be that worried about it. Yes. Okay, so the book is again The Language Game, How Improvisation Created Language and Changed the World. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Drs. Chader and Christiansen, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. I will also be leaving links to your work in the description box, and it was a real pleasure to have you on.
It's been a real pleasure to talk with you as ever, Fabi.
Yeah, and it was great fun. Thanks for having us.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Van Nagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.